There is a boy with an eye patch. He is standing in a crowd. Hundreds of boys just like him, all wearing the same yellow shirt, all with the same short brown hair, all blinking in the same uncertain way that boys do when they have been through something they do not yet have words for. He looks exactly like all the others. Same height, same slight build, same expression carefully arranged into something that reads as fear, or at least something close enough to it that nobody is going to look twice. And yet, he is not like any of them, not even slightly. Because while every other boy in that crowd is thinking about getting home, about what happened to them, about whether they will sleep tonight, or whether the darkness will feel too full of things, this boy is thinking about the next step. He already crushed something small under his shoe, and something he built himself, something that looked like a tiny transmitter, something that, if left intact, could have led people directly to him. He crushed it with the quiet precision of someone who has already thought 40 moves ahead, and now he is walking away, folding himself into the mass of frightened boys, disappearing before anyone has the sense to start wondering who he is. He does not run. Running draws attention. He just walks, calm and even, the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going. This is the moment we first truly see Evil Morty, even though the show does not call him that yet, even though we have no real name for what we just watched. We see a small boy dissolve into a crowd and become invisible, and something in us recognizes that this is not the beginning of the story. This is the end of a chapter in something that has been running for a very long time. This is someone who has already done the planning, already set the pieces in motion, already decided how this particular move ends. The show gave us almost nothing else. No backstory, no grand speech, no dramatic lighting shift, just a boy removing an eye patch, crushing a transmitter, and walking away. And somehow, that economy of gesture was more chilling than anything a monologue could have delivered. That was Season 1 of Rick and Morty. Episode 10, to be exact, which aired back in 2013. It would be 4 more seasons before we fully understood what we were looking at. And in those years, the questions accumulated the way questions do when something is genuinely strange. Slowly at first, then all at once. Until the space around the character is so dense with wondering that the actual answers, when they finally come, feel both inevitable and impossible. Who was this Morty? What did he want? Why would a Morty, a creature the entire architecture of the show is built to position as anxious, uncertain, and fundamentally reactive? Why would one of them look out at the world with that particular quality of stillness in their eyes? And why, after everything, does the answer turn out to be so deeply, uncomfortably reasonable? This is a story about that boy, about what he saw, what he understood, what he decided to do about it, and what all of it means when you sit quietly with it long enough to let it sink in. This is a story about the philosophy of Evil Morty, which turns out not to be a philosophy of evil at all, but something closer to a philosophy of clarity, of seeing a cage clearly enough to know exactly how the walls are built, and deciding that you are not going to spend the rest of your life pretending the bars are not there. Get comfortable. Let the weight of the day settle. We are going to think slowly through something that deserves that kind of attention. Section 1. The Boy with One Eye. Who Evil Morty actually is. Before we can talk about what Evil Morty believes, we need to talk about what he is, because the two things are not as separate as they might seem. In most stories, the villain exists in opposition to the hero. They are defined against each other, like shadow against light, and the villain's worldview is essentially a dark mirror of whatever the hero represents. You know what the hero stands for? And the villain stands for the opposite. And the conflict between them is legible because the terms are set from the beginning. Evil Morty does not work like this. He is not the dark mirror of our Morty. He is something more uncomfortable than that. He is a version of what our Morty could become if the right conditions were in place, which means the line between them is not a fixed wall, but a permeable one, and that is a much stranger thing to sit with. He first appears, as noted, in Season 1, Episode 10, an episode called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The premise sounds simple enough. Multiple Ricks across the multiverse are being murdered, and Rick C-137, our Rick, is accused. He and Morty escape custody and track down the real culprit, a Rick who has been operating outside the rules of the Citadel. Running a dungeon where dozens of Mortys are being held captive and connected to pain-generating devices. The logic is established earlier in the series. Mortis emit a specific brainwave frequency that essentially camouflages the much stronger frequency emitted by Ricks, making it possible for a Rick traveling with a Morty to fly under the radar of the Citadel's detection systems. This Rick has taken that concept to its extreme, using anguish rather than companionship to amplify the effect. And at the end of all this, there is the reveal. This so-called evil Rick was never operating under his own will. He was a puppet, mind-controlled through a receiver wired into his brain, and the one holding the transmitter was not another Rick, not a government agency, not some ancient cosmic force. It was a Morty, a single Morty, small and quiet, and standing right there in the middle of the crowd of victims, having woven himself so thoroughly into the narrative that the story's own logic protected him from suspicion. The show at this point had done something quietly radical. It had established a universe in which the fundamental dynamic, the oldest, most load-bearing assumption the whole thing was built on, was not as stable as it looked. Rick is the genius. Morty is the sidekick. Rick controls the adventure. Morty stumbles through it. This is the grammar of the show. And there was now, in the first season, a data point that contradicted the grammar entirely, without anyone in the story yet understanding what that data point meant. The quality of the acting and writing in that moment, the restraint of it, is worth appreciating for a second. Lesser storytelling would have given this Morty a dramatic reveal. There would have been thunder, or at least a swell in the music, something to signal that we are supposed to be frightened now. What the show actually does is quieter and more disorienting. It lets the ordinary-looking action, the small boy removing an eye patch and pressing something under his shoe, carry the full weight of the revelation. The horror is in the ordinariness of the gesture. He has done this before, he will do this again, whatever form it takes. He is not celebrating or despairing, he is just moving to the next step. Then 4 seasons of mostly standalone episodes. Side quests. Pickle Rick. The Love Potion Disaster. Adventures in micro-universes and time loops in alien civilizations. A slow accumulation of texture and character, the way sediment accumulates, each layer pressing down on what is beneath it, the overall shape of things only becoming visible from a sufficient distance. Season 3, Episode 7. The Citadel of Ricks has been rebuilt in the aftermath of Rick C-137, destroying the original version in the Season 3 premiere. There is now a presidential election, the first in Citadel history, and one of the candidates is a Morty. This Morty is running on a platform of reform and equality, and the Ricks on their news channels say this is ridiculous, that it is a gimmick, that a Morty running for president is the Citadel's version of a joke, and then the Morty wins. The final shot of that episode is the reveal. The campaign manager Morty, the one who had been working for him, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable, who had been killed for his doubts, is shown floating in space. And the files he was carrying are there too, showing the president's true identity, the eye patch Morty from Season 1. He removed the eye patch during the campaign, presenting as just another Morty, and the Ricks who were certain no Morty could ever be a genuine threat did not see it coming because they fundamentally could not imagine it coming. Their own certainty about the hierarchy was the blind spot he walked right through. And then he eliminated the entire Shadow Council of Ricks who ran the Citadel from behind the scenes Oz. Because they were people who knew enough to be dangerous and who would not be able to leave well enough alone. He was not cruel about it. He was not theatrical. He was precise because precision is what the situation required. And when it was done, he sat in the president's chair. Now, in the angle of the shot told us everything we needed to know about where this was going. It took until Season 5, the finale, for that destination to become fully visible. In an episode called Rick Morty Jack, all the pieces that had been placed over 4 years and change finally aligned. Evil Morty, who Rick finally calls by that name, who accepts it with a quiet amusement at how long it took, reveals what it was all for. Not revenge, not power, not the satisfaction of watching the people who built the cage burn inside it. He wanted out. That is the whole thing. That is the totality of his plan across roughly half a decade of the show's runtime. To leave. To step through a door that no Morty had ever been able to step through before, and into a part of the multiverse where the particular kind of imprisonment he had been subject to did not exist. To go somewhere where the game was not rigged from the foundation up. To live without Rick. And in Season 7, Episode 5, the picture fills in further. We get the origin. Just an ordinary Morty being treated the way Ricks treat Mortys, dragged on dangerous adventures, dismissed, pushed past the point where even the most forgiving version of a person finds the word enough, beginning to form somewhere in the back of their throat. And then the eye patch, and then the long game. The simplicity of it, once you know it, is almost disorienting. We had imagined complex trauma, elaborate personal mythology, a Rick he once loved and lost. Instead, now the show gave us something quieter and in some ways more devastating. Just a boy who got tired. Just a Morty who one day realized clearly and without drama that he did not want this, and then spent years making sure he could leave. That moment of realization, that shift from endurance to clarity, is where his philosophy begins. And it is worth understanding what exactly he saw when the clarity arrived. What he saw was the whole system. Not just the immediate injustice of being dragged on adventures and treated carelessly, not just the particular Rick he happened to be assigned to, but the architecture behind all of it, the way the multiverse itself had been arranged to guarantee certain outcomes, the way the people at the bottom of the arrangement were designed to stay there, not the way the whole structure had been built to look like nature when it was actually engineering. Seeing all of this at once with that level of clarity, this is the quality that separates him from every other Morty. Not intelligence alone, though he has that. Not willpower alone, though he has that too. The specific combination of being able to see the full scale of what is wrong and not being so overwhelmed by the scale that it becomes paralyzing. He looks at something enormous and says, "Fine, then the plan will need to be large." And he begins. What the show also suggests through the cold open of Unmortrican in Season 7 is that the specific spark was not complicated. His Rick got drunk, and Rick's drink is a matter of constant habit, but drunk Ricks are looser, more honest, and in this case, more casually cruel in the way that drunk people sometimes are with the people they take for granted. He said something dismissive. He said, essentially, quit if you hate it so much. And a Morty who had already been thinking for a very long time suddenly heard those words not as the throwaway dismissal they were intended as, but as a description of a real possibility that nobody had bothered to mention before. The option to quit. The possibility of simply not being this anymore. The idea that the role was not a permanent condition, but a situation one could, in theory, leave. He heard it as permission, which is unusual. Most people hear dismissal as dismissal. He heard it as an accidental specification of a door he had not known he could build. And he started building it that night. Section 2. The Wall Around Infinity. Understanding the central finite curve. Picture an infinite multiverse. Truly infinite, not just very large, but without end, without edge, without any direction you could travel that would bring you to a final wall or a final door. An infinity so complete that every possibility that can be imagined exists somewhere within it, and then every variation of every possibility, and then every variation of those variations, branching and folding and extending in every conceivable direction simultaneously. This is where Rick and Morty live. This is the environment the show has always claimed to occupy. Infinite universes, infinite Ricks, infinite Mortys. Every version of every choice, every path not taken made real somewhere by the simple fact of the multiverse's completeness. Now imagine that within that infinity, someone drew a circle. Not a small circle, not a modest boundary. An infinite circle which is itself a kind of absurdity, an infinite subset of the infinite whole, containing everything that fits one specific criterion. Every universe where a particular man is the smartest being alive. Every reality where a particular pattern of neural architecture happens to be the most sophisticated in existence. An infinite collection of universes where one man always wins. Not because he was born into each of those universes as the smartest being by chance, but because every universe where he was not the smartest has been placed on the other side of the boundary, rendered inaccessible, cut away from the navigable multiverse like a problem that has been quietly filed in a drawer that nobody is allowed to open. This is the central finite curve. This is what Rick and the other Ricks who founded the Citadel built underneath it, in secret, without telling the Mortys who lived there or the families who would be born into it or anyone else who did not already know. A wall around infinity. A carefully maintained illusion of natural order. A constructed reality in which the hierarchy that benefited them most was presented as simply the way things are, the inevitable consequence of intelligence, the natural result of Rick being the kind of person Rick is. The visual language the show uses to present this is worth noting. Evil Morty describes it in simple, concrete terms. They built a wall around infinity and separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man in the universe. And then the show gives us an image, a glowing helix of golden orbs, stretching upward like a strand of cosmic DNA, each orb a universe, the whole strand curving through a vaster darkness that represents the uncontained infinity beyond. The finitude is in the name, the central finite curve. An infinite subset of an infinite whole, which is mathematically coherent but experientially strange. How do you have infinity inside of infinity? The answer is that infinity does not work the way human intuition expects. You can have an infinite set of even numbers and an infinite set of all numbers, and the second set contains the first entirely while also being strictly larger. You can have an infinite collection of universes where Rick is the smartest person alive and an infinite collection of all other universes. And the first collection is genuinely infinite, even as it represents only a portion of the second. This matters because it closes the rhetorical escape hatch that might otherwise exist, the one that says, well, Rick said there are infinite dimensions, and if there are infinite dimensions, then surely there are infinite Ricks who are not the smartest person, and so the system isn't really universal. The answer the show gives is that Rick is technically right, that there are infinite dimensions, and he is technically not lying when he says so. The subset of infinity he has access to is still infinite. It is just not all of infinity. And he never mentioned the part he doesn't have access to because mentioning it would have required explaining why it was inaccessible, which would have required explaining the curve. Which would have required admitting that the multiverse had been sorted rather than explored. The thing about infinity, though, is that it makes certain things visible if you look at them long enough. An infinite set of Ricks, all of them the smartest beings in their respective universes, all of them looking out at a multiverse carefully arranged to confirm what they already believed about themselves, begins to reveal something not about the universe, but about the people who built the arrangement. The smartness is not a property of the universe. It is a property of the selection. They did not become the smartest beings in every universe. They sorted the universes to exclude every case where they were not. Evil Morty understood this. At some point, through some combination of his own observation and the partially downloaded contents of Rick's memories that he obtained during his very first plan in Season 1, he came to see the structure clearly. He saw that the cage was not incidental. It was not a side effect of anything. It was the product of deliberate, specific, sustained engineering. Ricks built it. They built it and they maintained it, and they used the Mortys who lived inside it as both tools for maintaining it and evidence of why it needed to exist. Because every Morty who orbited a Rick and deferred to a Rick and survived only because of a Rick was another small confirmation of the natural order that was never natural at all. The show has Evil Morty describe the central finite curve in a way that is worth going over carefully. That's because the language he uses reveals the precision of his understanding. He says they built a wall around infinity and separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where Rick is the smartest man in the universe. Every version of us, he says, has spent every version of all of our lives in one infinite crib built around an infinite baby. The word crib is doing a lot of work in that sentence. A crib is not a cage, not exactly. A cage is restraint by force. A crib is restraint by comfort, by softness, by the careful arrangement of things designed for a being who is not yet capable of making good decisions about the outside world. You put a baby in a crib because the baby needs protection from a world it cannot yet navigate. Like you build a crib around infinity because you need to believe, you need everyone to believe, that the outside world is dangerous in ways that justify staying inside the cushioned walls of the carefully curated subset. The baby in the crib. The entire multiverse reorganized to function as a nursery for one specific ego. This is not hyperbole. The show means it literally. The curve was built to ensure that wherever Rick traveled, he was always the smartest being in the room. Not through being genuinely the smartest in every conceivable reality, but through the careful exclusion of every reality where he was not. The Citadel of Ricks is both the seat of this project and its most visible manifestation. Think for a moment about what it actually is, say, an entire civilization, and a city large enough to have neighborhoods and political parties and fast food restaurants and schools populated entirely by two kinds of people. Ricks and Mortys. Every Rick is a genius. Every Morty is a sidekick. The schools that Mortis attend are not schools in any meaningful sense. They are conditioning programs. The curriculum exists to teach Mortis how to be better at their assigned function, which is to orbit Ricks and absorb danger and provide the neural camouflage that Ricks need to move through the multiverse without being detected by the Citadel's own systems. A Morty in Morty school is being trained in the art of their own usefulness, which is also the art of their own expendability. And when a Morty dies, the Citadel replaces them. But the Ricks who ran the institution figured out fairly quickly that natural Mortis who were born the old-fashioned way, through families that were arranged into existence by the same quiet engineering that built the curve, were not efficient enough as a supply chain. So they started manufacturing Mortys, cloning them. The thing that is supposed to be a person, a relationship, a grandson who matters, was converted into inventory. There is a particular quote from Evil Morty in the Season 5 finale that is worth sitting with slowly. He says that there are not actually infinite versions of their grandfather. He says that Rick is an infinite smear of one particular pattern of selfishness and brittleness, and that all the Mortys who have ever existed are attached to that pattern through their weakness and their forgiveness. Their weakness meaning the ordinary fragility of caring about someone who treats them carelessly. Their forgiveness meaning the particular quality of Mortis, specifically designed, specifically cultivated, and specifically reinforced, that ensures they keep coming back. The phrase infinite smear is brutal in the most specific way. It refuses the mythology of the multiverse that the show has been building. The Ricks are not infinite variations on a theme. They are infinite copies of the same fundamental pattern of dysfunction. They are not diverse expressions of human potential across every dimension of possibility. They are one shitty old man, repeated infinitely, each repetition convinced of its uniqueness, each one absolutely certain that its particular brand of narcissism and brilliance and emotional unavailability is distinct and special. None of them recognizing that the repetition itself is the point, that the sameness is what makes the arrangement possible. This is the most devastating intellectual blow he delivers. Not to the Rick's power, but to their mythology of themselves. Section 3. The Architecture of Control. How the Citadel came to be. Before we can fully inhabit the world Evil Morty is reacting against, we need to understand how that world was built. Not in the abstract, not as mythology, but as a specific chain of events that led to a specific structure. Because the Citadel did not always exist, and the central finite curve did not always exist. And the fact that they had a beginning is also the fact that they could have been otherwise. The story of how the Citadel came to be is also the story of Rick C-137, which the show finally gives us in the Season 5 finale. It is a story that starts with grief. A version of Rick, not our Rick, but the Rick who would become our Rick, was living a quiet life. A family, a wife named Diane, a daughter named Beth. Ordinary things that somehow contain the entire weight of what a life is supposed to be. And then another Rick arrived, a Rick from a different dimension, offering interdimensional travel, offering the portal gun, and everything that implies. Our Rick refused. He wanted his ordinary things. The other Rick, the one who would eventually be known as Rick Prime, responded to this refusal by killing Diane and Beth. Not as a punishment exactly, or not only as a punishment, but as a removal of the attachments that might have kept Rick ordinary. The grief that followed was total. And out of that grief came something that would eventually reshape the multiverse. A Rick with no remaining reason to stay in one place, with no remaining reason to be gentle, with no remaining reason to care about the consequences of being the kind of intelligence he actually was. He built the portal gun himself, eventually. He began traveling. He began hunting for Rick Prime, the version of himself that had done this. The version who was out there somewhere in the infinite multiverse, existing, continuing to exist while Diane did not. And in the process of hunting, he encountered other Ricks and killed them. Because in his grief, he could not reliably distinguish between the Rick who deserved it and the Ricks who did not. And after a while, it stopped mattering because the killing had its own momentum. The survivors of this killing spree were eventually numerous enough to constitute something like an alliance. Not because they liked each other. Ricks, by nature, are not people who naturally form cooperatives. They are too independent, too certain of their own primacy, too convinced that the best solution to any problem is the one they personally devised. But the threat of C-137 was specific and immediate enough that they were willing to do something they would never ordinarily do: coordinate. The result was the peace treaty and the Citadel and eventually the central finite curve. Rick C-137 participated in the construction, apparently, though his motives for doing so remain somewhat murky. The dominant interpretation is that he helped build it as a way to contain Rick Prime, to limit the possible universes the other Rick could hide in, to narrow the infinite into something that could eventually be searched. Whether or not that was his genuine reasoning, the effect was the same. A portion of the multiverse was walled off, and everything inside that wall was redesigned to confirm the greatness of the people who built it. What is fascinating, from the perspective of what this story ultimately means, is how a structure built for ostensibly understandable reasons becomes something its builders do not fully control. Rick C-137 may have had specific and even somewhat legitimate reasons for contributing to the curve's construction. But the curve he helped build did not remain a personal hunting blind. It became infrastructure. It became the physical framework of an entire civilization. It became the thing that every Rick who ever lived on the Citadel or used a portal gun simply accepted as the shape of the world, the way generations of people accept the shapes of the worlds they are born into without asking who built them. The showrunner Scott Marder, in commentary on the Season 5 finale, describes Rick as the founding father of the Citadel, practically the only one in terms of the actual architectural and conceptual work of building it. And like many founding fathers, the institution that emerged from his work bore the marks of his particular pathologies, organized around his specific fears and desires, but perpetuating the logic of his specific moment long after that moment had passed, and the circumstances that produced it had changed entirely. Rick went off and left it behind. The Council of Ricks, who understood its purposes with less ambivalence than he did, remained. And they built on what he had started in the direction of their own interests, which were simply the interests of people who had found a good deal and wanted to maintain it. Their good deal was living in a section of the multiverse where they were always on top. The curve was the mechanism that maintained the deal, and so they maintained the curve. What he left behind was a society that had the bones of his design but none of his reservations about it. The Council of Ricks who took over the Citadel had no complicated feelings about the central finite curve. They liked it. They liked it the way people who benefit from a rigged system always like the rigged system. Not because they are villains exactly, but because the rigging feels natural when you are on the winning side of it. So the Citadel ran. And the Morty market developed. And the schools that conditioned the Mortys to be better sidekicks opened their doors. And generations of Mortys were born into a universe that had been specifically shaped to ensure they would never wonder about the shape. The Morty market deserves specific attention because it is one of the more quietly horrifying revelations the show makes. The Citadel eventually discovered that naturally occurring Mortys were not reliable enough as a supply. Too unpredictable, too slow, too dependent on the vagaries of actual human behavior. And so the Ricks running the Citadel began arranging for Beth and Jerry to meet, in virtually every universe. Through calculated interventions in the social circumstances of two specific people, the Citadel manufactured the conditions that would produce the relationships that would produce the children that would be cloned and conditioned and supplied to Ricks who needed the camouflage they provided. A Morty was not, from the perspective of the institution, a person. A Morty was a product, a resource, an output of a production system that had been deliberately designed and deliberately maintained and that operated continuously, manufacturing the very beings who would then be educated to accept their manufactured status. Think about what this means for the relationship at the heart of the show. Every time Rick says something genuine to Morty, at every moment of real warmth, every adventure that deepens their bond, all of it takes place within a context where the Morty's very existence was arranged by the same institution that needs Mortis to be forgiving and loyal. This does not make the moments false. Genuine feeling can exist within a managed situation. But it does mean the situation is more complicated than it appears. And Evil Morty is the character who has done the work of understanding what that complexity actually consists of. Here is the quality of what was built. It is not primarily coercive in the obvious sense. There are no guards at the boundary of the central finite curve telling Mortys they cannot leave. There are no documents explaining that the multiverse has been sectioned off to protect Rick's ego. The control is more elegant than that. Plus, it works through the combination of omission and environment. If you have never been told that part of the multiverse has been hidden from you, and if you have never had access to the tools that would let you detect that something is hidden, you do not experience the hiding as a loss. You simply experience your world as the world, which is the most effective form of containment there is. The kind that does not feel like containment at all. Evil Morty had that language. Somehow, through his own intelligence and the partially obtained memories of Rick, he had put together enough of the picture to understand the whole of it. And once you can see a cage, the cage is no longer invisible, and the fact that nobody else can see it does not make it less of a cage. And it just means you are the only one who knows how alone you are in wanting to be somewhere else. This isolation, the specific loneliness of clarity in a world designed to prevent clarity, is something the show does not dwell on but cannot avoid implying. He knew what the curve was for years before he did anything visible about it. He lived among people who were inside the same cage he was inside, who experienced it as not a cage, who would have found his analysis incomprehensible or threatening if he had shared it. He carried it alone. He built toward the exit alone. The patience we talked about in the last section is partly a function of the actual time requirements of the plan, but it is also a function of the fact that there was no one to share the plan with, that no one whose solidarity could sustain him in the long stretches where nothing was visible yet. He is, in the deepest sense, a singular person. Not in the flattering way that word is sometimes used, but in the literal way, he is one, where everyone else around him is part of a collective whose collective assumptions he does not share, and the singularity is both the source of his power and the condition of his isolation. Section 4. The Birth of Awareness. The moment everything changed. There is a moment in almost every story about someone who eventually refuses a system when the awareness arrives. It is not always dramatic. It does not always come with music or a mentor or a symbolic act. Sometimes it comes quietly, the way dawn comes. Not as a sudden appearance, but as a slow accumulation of light, until eventually you realize you can see things you could not see before and you cannot remember exactly when the darkness lifted. For Evil Morty, the show gives us the moment in Season 7, and it turns out to be the most ordinary thing imaginable. A Morty and his Rick, fighting. The Morty saying things that Mortys always say about being tired, about being treated badly, about wanting to be seen as more than a tool. And the Rick saying what Ricks say, which is something between dismissal and contempt, with perhaps a thin layer of actual caring buried so far underneath that it is genuinely unclear whether the Morty can or should take any comfort from its existence. And then the Rick says something. He says, look, if you hate it so much, just quit. Just leave. As if this were a job and not the fundamental condition of his existence. As if there were somewhere to quit to, some other life already waiting, some door that opened onto a world where a Morty could exist outside the gravitational field of a Rick. The show has Evil Morty hear this differently than it was intended. Not as flippant dismissal, though it was certainly that, but as a genuine possibility that the Rick had accidentally articulated. The option of leaving. The possibility that the situation was not permanent. The idea that what felt like the inescapable terms of existence was actually just a very well-designed cage, and that cages, however well designed, are built by people, and things built by people can be dismantled by people, or at least by Mortis. What follows is the eye patch, the device he builds under it, the mechanism that will allow him to take control of a Rick, to use a Rick as his instrument rather than being used as the Rick's instrument to reverse the power dynamic through technology, rather than try to negotiate a different arrangement through whatever passes for kindness or reason in that world. The choice of the eye patch as the delivery mechanism is almost too good not to appreciate for a moment. An eye patch covers one eye, which, in the visual language of storytelling, has a very long association with pirates, with people who operate outside the rules, with a particular kind of freedom that is also a particular kind of danger. But it is also something that hides, something that conceals. And what it conceals in this case is the small transmitter that represents his refusal. The thing that makes him different from every other Morty. The thing that means he is not what he appears to be. He wore the eye patch and everyone saw Morty with a distinctive fashion choice. Nobody saw what the eye patch was actually doing, which was being the constant reminder of his own decision. Not a reminder of damage or trauma, but a reminder of the moment he stopped accepting the terms he had been given and started writing his own. The awareness that precedes all of this is the awareness of the system, and the system is built on a specific and elegant lie. The lie is not a simple one. It does not say you are inferior. It does not say you are a slave. It says something much more insidious than either of those things, because insidious things are the ones that work. What the system says, through every institution and arrangement and implicit assumption, is that this is just how things are. That Rick is the smartest being in every universe is not presented as a policy. It is presented as a fact of nature, like gravity, like entropy. It is the default truth from which all reasoning proceeds. But if the truth is not a fact of nature but a fact of construction, if the universe was sorted rather than explored, then everything downstream of that constructed truth is built on a foundation that was never what it claimed to be. Every moment of Rick's authority, every moment of Morty's deference, every school curriculum, every social arrangement, every quiet assumption that a Morty without a Rick is less than a Morty with one, all of it draws its legitimacy from a premise that does not hold. This is the kind of thing that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. It is not information that can be processed and then filed alongside everything else, to be retrieved occasionally but not to disturb the overall structure of how you understand things. It is a change of the ground itself. When you learn that the foundation was constructed and not given, everything that was built on the foundation becomes subject to revision, because its claim to permanence rested entirely on the claim that the foundation could not be otherwise. Evil Morty does not have a crisis about this. That is one of the things that makes him genuinely unusual. He has the awareness, and he has the clarity, and instead of spiraling into paralysis or nihilism or desperate attempts to force others to see what he sees, he simply begins planning. He begins very quietly placing pieces where they need to be, building toward an exit that does not yet exist, in the patient way that people who are used to working alone build things, one step at a time, without the luxury of visible progress, trusting the overall shape of the plan even in the long stretches where nothing appears to be happening. The patience is itself a philosophical statement, though it is easy to miss it as such. Patience in the face of a system that insists on your secondary status, patience in the face of Ricks who dismiss the idea that a Morty could be a real actor rather than a supporting character. This patience is not passivity. It is the strategic choice of someone who has looked at the terrain clearly enough to know that rushing is the wrong approach, but that the only viable path to freedom runs through the specific choke points he can actually influence, and that any deviation from the plan in the direction of visible confrontation will cost him the one thing he cannot afford to lose, the advantage of being underestimated. He built his freedom the way you build anything under conditions where failure is not recoverable, carefully, thoroughly, and largely in the dark. Think about the specific things that had to be true for his plan to work. He needed Rick C-137's brain scan, at least partially, to eventually get access to the Citadel's dimensional drive schematics. He needed to be present in the Citadel without being identified. He needed to accumulate knowledge of Ricks across the multiverse, their individual variations, their weaknesses, up the way each particular Rick processed and stored information. He needed to eventually gain a position of sufficient power within the Citadel to access and modify the dimensional drive. And he needed to do all of this in the presence of the smartest beings in their respective universes, who would be actively looking for exactly this kind of threat, while hiding under the assumption that no Morty could be doing it. Every step of this required him to be simultaneously present and invisible, active and apparently passive, intelligent in ways that could not be detected as intelligence. This is not a simple thing to sustain. Most plans with this degree of complexity fail because they require perfect execution over too long a time horizon. The person changes. The circumstances change. The patience runs out. But he apparently does not have this weakness, or rather he has found a way to hold it in suspension for as long as the plan requires. The satisfaction he takes from each step is the satisfaction of the step itself, of things being exactly where they need to be, of the system doing what he anticipated rather than what would surprise him. He is getting exactly what he needs from each successful move, and what he needs from it is information that the next step is viable, not recognition that he is the one doing it. Section 5. Patience as a Weapon. The long game of evil Morty. There is a kind of intelligence that expresses itself through speed, through the rapid connection of distant ideas, through the ability to improvise solutions in real time, to think faster than the situation is developing, and always be one step ahead of the immediate moment. This is the kind of intelligence most associated with Rick Sanchez, and it is spectacular when it works. And it is the kind that tends to produce geniuses who live in the wreckage of their own decisions, because the same speed that generates the solutions also bypasses the checks that might have prevented some of the disasters. And there is another kind, the kind that does not accelerate, the kind that slows down instead, that looks at the full extent of the problem, that maps the terrain with the understanding that you may not be able to see all of it yet, and then begins placing things in the positions they need to be in for a plan to work. Not today, not next week, but eventually. When the conditions have been prepared and the moment has actually arrived, Evil Morty has the second kind. Not exclusively. He is clearly capable of rapid, effective action when the situation calls for it. But his primary mode of operation across the entire arc of his story is the slow kind, the accumulating kind. The kind that looks at a problem spanning years and treats each stage of the solution as worth the time it takes to get it right. Consider what he did first. In Season 1, his plan was to get access to Rick C-137's brain, specifically the schematics of the Citadel's dimensional drive that were stored in Rick's memories. The technical information he would need to eventually build a machine capable of punching through the central finite curve. He could not access this directly. He had no portal gun of his own, no way to reach Rick, no leverage over the most heavily protected brain in the multiverse. So he built a reason for Rick to come to him. He found a Rick he could control. He used this Rick as an instrument, directing him to kidnap Mortis from across the multiverse and keep them in conditions of deliberate suffering. A scheme that, from the outside, appeared to be the work of a rogue Rick, operating from pathological cruelty, which meant it was exactly the kind of thing that the Council of Ricks would have to respond to, and exactly the kind of thing that Rick C-137, the most famous dissident in the Citadel's history, would inevitably get blamed for. Which meant Rick C-137 would have every reason to track down the actual culprit to clear his name. Which meant Rick C-137 would eventually arrive at the location where Evil Morty was waiting. That he arranged for his own kidnapping. He staged his own captivity. He was the monster in the dungeon and the imprisoned innocent and the detective all at once. When Rick arrived, Evil Rick began downloading Rick's memories. Not all of them, but enough, before the plan was disrupted. Evil Morty, in the chaos of the aftermath, walked out in a crowd of genuine victims and was never suspected, because the very quality that he was engineering his way past, the assumption that a Morty cannot be the one in control, was the same assumption that protected him in the moment of his escape. He had the partial download. Not everything he needed, but enough to begin working with. And he went dark. For seasons, nothing. Or nothing visible. The show had other things to do, but Evil Morty was in the background, accumulating, erasing his own records from the Citadel's systems, killing and downloading the knowledge of multiple Ricks across the multiverse. This detail from the Unmortrican flashback is important, because it means the intelligence he brought to his eventual plan was not merely his own native ability, but a sum of stolen knowledge from dozens of the smartest beings in their respective universes. He did not become as smart as a Rick. He became the composite of many Ricks, which in some ways is more useful than being a single Rick, because he had access to a broader array of approaches and did not have any particular Rick's blind spots. The campaign deserves extended attention, because it is the most public and socially complex thing he does, and it reveals something important about how he thinks about people. He ran on a platform of Morty equality, not on a platform of Rick destruction, not on a platform of dismantling the hierarchy, not on anything that would immediately register as a threat to the Ricks, who would need to let this election proceed without forcibly ending it. He talked about fairness. He talked about the dignity of Mortis, about the way the current system treated them as assets rather than people. He connected with Mortis, who were genuinely tired of their secondary status, who had never had a political voice, who responded to the sight of someone like themselves saying something they had always known was true. The resonance was real. The things he said about Morty equality were not fabrications. They were accurate observations about an unjust system, delivered by someone who understood that system in more detail than any other Morty had ever understood it. The Mortys who voted for him were not being deceived about the substance of his message. They were being deceived about its purpose, which is a different kind of deception, and perhaps a worse one. And the Ricks, watching him campaign, laughed. They let it proceed because they were certain it could not succeed. And this certainty was itself the product of the arrogance that the curve had built into them. A Morty could not win, which meant a Morty candidate was not a real threat, which meant there was no reason to take extraordinary measures. Their contempt was the thing that protected him from interference. This is one of the show's most elegant observations about the relationship between arrogance and vulnerability. The Ricks were not stupid. They were, by definition, the smartest beings in their respective universes, but the central finite curve had built a specific blind spot into their intelligence, the inability to imagine a Morty as a genuine strategic actor. And a blind spot in the smartest person in the room is still a blind spot, and if you know it is there and they do not, it is the most useful thing in the world. He won. And then, within what appears to be a very short time of winning, he had the entire Shadow Council of Ricks who secretly ran things shot out of an airlock. Not dramatically, not as a statement or a declaration, simply as the removal of obstacles, done efficiently and early enough that nobody who might have stopped it had time to organize. He did not declare victory. He did not gloat. He got to work building what he had spent years learning to build, at using the resources of the most powerful institution in the central finite curve to do what single individuals cannot do alone: manufacture a way out. There is something in the quality of his patience that connects to a deeper truth about what it means to want freedom rather than power. People who want power are impatient because power is relational. It requires an audience, requires the visible acknowledgement of others, requires being recognized as powerful by someone else in order to fully feel itself. The gratification is immediate or it is nothing, because what power provides is the ongoing experience of being powerful, and that experience cannot be banked for later. But freedom is different. Freedom can be saved. You can build toward it, and it accrues, and the accumulation is real, even when it is not yet visible. And the moment of arrival, when it finally comes, is not diminished by having been deferred. In fact, it is enriched by it, because you know exactly what it cost, and you know exactly what it means. And neither of those things are abstract to you because you spent years working toward them. Evil Morty is not patient because he is indifferent to the outcome. He is patient because he has correctly identified patience as the only viable method. And the correctness of that identification is itself evidence of the thing the Ricks never believed: that a Morty could think this clearly about something that complicated over this long a horizon. Section 6. Power, Elections, and the Language of Revolution. The episode known as the Ricklantis Mix-Up, which is also called Tales from the Citadel, is one of the most politically dense pieces of television in Rick and Morty's entire run. And it is worth spending some time with it, not because it is particularly entertaining in the traditional sense, but because of what it shows about the nature of the system Evil Morty eventually destroyed. The Citadel that the episode depicts is not a place of explicit cruelty. It is worse than that. It is a place of ordinary, institutional, mundane injustice, the kind that does not require anyone to be specifically cruel, that runs on the accumulated effects of arrangements that everyone accepts as normal and therefore no longer has to justify. The episode weaves together several distinct storylines. There is the election, with candidate Morty running against a series of Rick candidates on a platform of Morty equality. There is the story of J22, a Rick who works on an assembly line manufacturing cookies infused with the memory of a Rick who was happy, simple Rick, whose tears of genuine human joy have been extracted and commodified. There is the story of Cop Rick and Cop Morty navigating the policing of Mortytown, the ghetto where Rickless Mortys live. There are 4 Mortys sneaking away from their school on an adventure reminiscent of Stand By Me. Each storyline is doing something different. Together, they construct a portrait of a society organized around exploitation that is so complete and so normalized that the exploitation has become invisible to almost everyone who participates in it. The J22 storyline is particularly clear-eyed about what happens when the logic of the Citadel is followed to its conclusion. Simple Rick's happiness was genuine, that he found contentment in something small and human, watching his daughter be happy. The Citadel extracted that contentment, turned it into a chemical compound, and sold it to other Ricks who were unable to access anything similar in their own lives, because the Citadel's arrangement of their lives did not produce the conditions for it. The cruelest possible reading of the Simple Rick situation is that the Citadel created the emotional poverty that made the Simple Rick cookie profitable, and then sold the cure to the disease it had created. This is the world that the show is showing us when it shows us the Citadel. And this is the world that Evil Morty's candidate Morty enters when he runs for president. And the show is very specific about what his candidacy does. It gives the Mortys at the bottom of this arrangement a name for what they already knew was wrong, and it creates the first political vehicle in the Citadel's history through which the second class might actually make its preferences legible to power. His speeches are not demagogic, exactly, or not only that. They contain real analysis. He is telling people things that are true, that the system treats Mortis unfairly, that this unfairness is structural rather than incidental, that reform is possible if enough people decide it matters. And the Mortys who vote for him are not being manipulated in the simple sense, because the things he is saying are real. They respond to genuine truth delivered by someone who clearly understands what they live with, because he lives with it too. Or rather, he did. He has moved beyond it in some important way, has developed a clarity about the system that most of its participants are not permitted to have. He has the clarity, and he is using it, and what he is using it for is not the welfare of the Mortys who vote for him. It is his own exit. When he wins and immediately clears out the Shadow Council, the show does something interesting. It does not slow down for a moral reckoning. The executions happen quickly, and the episode moves on, and the Citadel's surviving citizens briefly experience the new president as a potential reformer before the episode ends and the implications are left to accumulate between seasons. This speed is partly structural. The episode has a lot to do with it, but it is also tonally appropriate to how evil Morty himself experiences the moment. This is not a milestone, this is a step. He does not linger. The choice to run on Morty equality rather than on any of his actual objectives raises a question about the ethics of political messaging that the show is clearly interested in even if it does not pursue it explicitly. Is it wrong to use true claims for purposes other than their stated ones? He tells Mortis that Morty equality matters. This is true. Does the fact that he does not personally intend to pursue Morty equality make the claim a lie? Or does the truth of the claim stand independent of his intentions? The Mortys who voted for him believed in something real. The fact that their votes were a resource he was consuming, rather than a mandate he intended to honor, is a betrayal. But the thing they believed in was not false. This is one of the more unsettling aspects of his character, and it is unsettling in a specifically political way. He understood that the most powerful political resource was genuine grievance, genuinely held by people who had real reason for it. And he understood how to speak to that grievance authentically because he shared the grievance, even if he did not share the destination the grievance was supposed to lead toward. His authenticity was real. His representation of their cause was accurate. His intention to serve that cause was non-existent. These things can all be simultaneously true, and the fact that they can is one of the harder lessons in the episode. Section 7. What Evil Morty Actually Believes. His core philosophy. Here is what Evil Morty believes, stripped to its essential form. He believes that a consciousness capable of self-determination should not be subject to conditions that prevent self-determination. He believes that a being with the capacity to understand its own situation, to evaluate that situation, and to act on that evaluation should not be trapped inside arrangements designed to prevent exactly that kind of agency. He believes that the specific form of imprisonment represented by the central finite curve and the citadel is not merely inconvenient, but is an active violation of something that matters. Something that should not be violated regardless of how sophisticated or stable or naturalistically presented the violation is. This is not a complicated philosophy in its foundations. In its simplest form, it is a statement about freedom and what freedom requires. Not just the absence of explicit coercion, not just the freedom to make choices within a constrained set of options, but the freedom to exist in a universe where the available options have not been selected in advance by someone who benefits from limiting them. What makes it complicated, what makes it Evil Morty's rather than a straightforward liberation philosophy, is the method. He does not believe in collective liberation. He does not believe in reforming the system. He does not believe that the citadel could be made into something worth preserving if only the right people were in charge of it. He believes, with a completeness that is almost total, that the structure itself is the problem. That the arrangement of Ricks and Mortis as it exists inside the curve is not a structure that can be redeemed, and that the only response to an unredeemable structure is to exit it rather than try to fix it. One of the most revealing things about his philosophy is the specific quality of contempt he expresses for what he calls sellout Mortys. These are the Mortys who have been shaped by the system so thoroughly that they not only accept their secondary status, but actively perform gratitude for it, who pursue the approval of their Ricks as though it were the highest achievement available to them, who define their own goodness in terms of their usefulness to someone else. He says when he encounters Morty's obvious loyalty to Rick in the Season 5 finale, that sellout Mortis kill him, and that he would hate them more than the Ricks they worship if there were any point to it. But there is no point, he continues, because they were bred for it and cannot help it. The pivot from contempt to understanding is philosophically important. He does not ultimately sustain the contempt, because the contempt would require him to hold the Mortis responsible for something they were designed to be. The manufacturing of forgiving Mortis is a choice made by the institution, not by the Mortis themselves. They did not consent to be manufactured this way. They were shaped this way, and the shaping happened before any of the choices they now make within its parameters, and the philosophical weight of the manufacture falls on those who manufactured, not on those who were made. This is a position with a kind of moral generosity in it, even though it looks like coldness from the outside. He releases the individual Mortis from blame by correctly locating the source of the problem at the level of the system. And then, having correctly located it, he acts on his analysis rather than simply having it, which is the difference between understanding something and actually doing anything about what you understand. He also believes something specific and important about the nature of his own clarity. He seems to understand that the awareness he has the awareness that the curve exists, that the system is constructed, that the forgiveness of Mortis is engineered, is genuinely rare, not because Mortis are incapable of it in principle, but because the conditions for developing it are systematically unavailable to the people inside the system. He had access to Rick's memories, yet he had his own unusual intelligence. He had the combination of factors that made the picture visible to him when it was invisible to everyone around him. He does not seem to take moral credit for this. He does not present himself as more virtuous or more deserving of freedom than the Mortys who remain inside the cage. He simply has the awareness, and having it, he cannot unfeel it. An unfelt awareness produces a person who acts on it rather than tries to forget it. What he also believes, and what comes through most clearly in the moments when he is most honest, is that freedom is not comfortable. That the alternative to the cage is not a more spacious cage. That leaving means going somewhere unknown, without the structural supports the cage provided even while it imprisoned. Like without the certainty of outcome that comes from being inside a system that was designed to produce specific results. He is heading somewhere the show cannot fully describe because it exists outside the territory the show has been mapping. And he goes willingly. That willingness, that lack of hesitation at the threshold of the unknown, is the fullest expression of his philosophy. It is easy to criticize the status quo. It is much harder to actually commit to what comes after the status quo, to step through the door and trust that the freedom on the other side, however unfamiliar, is worth the cost of the path that brought you there. There is also something in how he talks about Rick that is worth examining. He does not hate Rick exactly. He does not describe his decades-long project as revenge or as motivated by anything personal toward Rick C-137 specifically. He describes it as being sick of the pattern Rick represents, which is different. He is sick of the infinite smear. He is sick of the arrangement. He is sick of the universe organized around a repeated dysfunction. Rick C-137 is the specific instance that generated the memories he needed, which is why their paths kept intersecting. But the animosity, insofar as it exists, is directed at the structure rather than the person. This is philosophically coherent in a way that makes him harder to oppose morally. It is easy to argue against revenge. It is harder to argue against the refusal of an unjust arrangement. If he were motivated by hatred of Rick as an individual, you could address that motivation. Yeah, because he is motivated by the accurate perception of a systemically unjust arrangement, addressing his motivation would require addressing the systemic injustice, which the characters who might want to stop him have no real interest in doing. Section 8, the ethics of escape? Was he right? Déjà. Every genuinely interesting villain poses a question that the story cannot fully answer for you. Not a question about whether they were right to use their specific methods, because the methods are usually indefensible and the story knows it, but a question about the deeper logic, the underlying claim, the thing they are responding to that is real even when their response is not. Evil Morty's question is this. When you are inside a system that is both wrong and too large to fix, when leaving requires destructive methods because there is no door provided, when you are not responsible for the people the system has trapped alongside you, but you know they exist and you know what they are trapped in, what do you owe them? The honest answer is that this is a question moral philosophy has been working on for a very long time without arriving at a consensus. There is a version of the answer that says the escape is justified, that freedom is a high enough value that pursuing it does not require the permission of those you leave behind, that nobody who is themselves imprisoned has the standing to demand that you stay in the cell with them rather than take the opportunity to escape when it comes. This version does not require that you be callous about those who remain. You can be genuinely sorry about their situation, but you can recognize the injustice of it. And you can still go because going is the only choice available that actually changes anything for you. There is another version that says the escape is a betrayal, that the specific nature of what evil Morty did, using the Mortys who believed in him as a vehicle for his own departure, leaving them in the ruins of the institution he destroyed on his way out, cannot be separated from the escape itself. The show lets both of these versions exist without adjudicating between them. The main Morty, who hears evil Morty's argument and understands it and chooses to stay with Rick anyway, is not shown to be right or wrong exactly. He is shown to be a person who made a choice under conditions that were not entirely free. What the show does seem to be committed to is the idea that evil Morty's diagnosis is correct, even if his treatment is disputable. The curve is real. The manufacture of Mortis is real. The engineering of forgiveness as a compliance mechanism is real. The arrogance that allowed the Ricks to build all of this and maintain it without serious doubt about whether they should is real. These are not things the show presents as merely his perspective. They are things the show confirms. His self-awareness is one of the things that makes him hard to simply dismiss. He knows what he is doing, he knows the cost. He decides that the cost is worth paying, and he pays it. He accepts the label of evil, in the end, with the specific point that the label as applied to him is definitional rather than moral. He is evil because he is sick of Rick. And anyone who has ever been sick of Rick is evil in the same sense. And the sense in which he is evil is exactly the sense in which the system that applied the label needs people to stay put. Whether he is right is not a question the show answers. and not a question I am going to answer for you here. What I will say is that the fact that the question is genuinely hard is itself meaningful. It means the show has created a character whose moral situation is real in the way that moral situations in the actual world are real. Complicated, resistant to easy judgment, full of genuine competing claims that cannot all be honored simultaneously. There is also an interesting question about the quality of his agency in comparison to everyone else in the story. Rick makes choices that cause harm across multiple dimensions on a regular basis. Now, he buries bodies in backyards. He abandons his family. He occasionally destroys civilizations by accident and feels mildly bad about it. The show generally treats Rick's harms as part of the texture of who he is, rather than as indictments that require him to be condemned. Evil Morty causes harm in the service of a specific, clearly articulated goal that he pursues with complete awareness of what he is doing. The show holds him to a stricter moral standard than it holds Rick, which is perhaps appropriate. Intentional harm for gain is different from careless harm from self-absorption, but which also reveals something about which kind of person the show is more comfortable with. The careless genius is charming. The calculating escapee is frightening. This asymmetry is worth sitting with. The system produced both of them. The Ricks who built the curve were not held to any accounting. The Morty who dismantled it is called evil. The word follows the threat to the arrangement rather than the ethical weight of the actions, which is exactly the mechanism Evil Morty described when he accepted the label. Section 9. Freedom on the other side. What lies beyond the curve? He goes through the portal. The last thing we see of him in the Season 5 finale is a small figure in a spacesuit, piloting a small ship through a breach in the fabric of the constrained multiverse, heading into a region of the infinite that has never been mapped by any Citadel cartographer. The Gold Portal. The yellow light that marks the boundary between the world designed for Ricks and the world that was never designed for anyone, that simply exists in its original, unmanipulated state. Well, what is out there? The show has not told us much. This is partly because the writers chose not to immediately develop the territory beyond the curve as a major story arc. The breach was repaired by the hyper-intelligent dinosaurs in Season 6 within a few episodes, and Rick and Morty largely returned to its episodic format. This choice has been interpreted as the show retreating from its own implications, and perhaps it is, but it also has the accidental effect of leaving the territory beyond the curve genuinely open, uncharacterized by the show's own narrative, still really a place that exists beyond the frame rather than within it. In Season 7, the show confirms that Evil Morty is out there, that he is building something, that he has assembled a personal refuge in a dimension with no Rick, while with resources he has gathered from across a genuinely free multiverse. He is shown in his space mansion, going on adventures that are entirely his own, collecting the crystals and materials he needs to sustain his sanctuary, living in the particular kind of quiet that belongs to someone who has finally arrived somewhere they chose. Not someone who has achieved comfort at the expense of ambition, but someone whose ambition was always aimed at exactly this. The specific quality of what he has built is worth noting. He is not ruling anything. He is not in the process of acquiring power or influence or strategic advantage over anyone. He has a mansion, which is comfortable but not imperial. He is gathering resources for his own purposes, not for the purposes of an institution or a cause. He is, in the most literal sense, living for himself. Doing what he wants to do, in a place he chose, without reference to what anyone else needs from him, or expects of him, or has decided he is for. This is the destination. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of having defeated a system. Just the quiet of being a person in a universe that does not require you to be anything in particular. The freedom is not dramatic. It does not have a theme. It just has the texture of a life that is actually his. What the show is very careful to show in the Unmortrican episode is that the peace beyond the curve is real peace. Not performed peace, not the suppression of unresolved conflict, but the actual peace of a person who got what they wanted and is making use of it. He is irritated when Rick and Morty's activities disturb that peace, genuinely irritated. Tell me the way you are when something disrupts something you value, not in the way you are when something reminds you of an unresolved pain. His peace was there. It was interrupted. He wants it back. The fact that he intervenes to help Rick and Morty deal with Rick Prime, rather than simply moving his mansion further away, is interesting in itself. He could arguably have avoided the whole thing, but the Omega device represents a threat that no dimensional relocation can address. A weapon capable of killing someone across every dimension simultaneously would follow him anywhere. So he comes back, not from connection or compassion, but from the same clear-eyed assessment of what his situation requires that drove every other choice he has made. What happens in Unmortrican is the most direct engagement the show has given us with Evil Morty as a fully formed adult person rather than a mystery or a plan. He is snarky, specific, unenthused about being there, clear about his own priorities, and genuinely effective in ways that require something more than cold analysis. He switches places with Morty to deceive Rick Prime. He lets Rick deliver the killing blow. He destroys the Omega device rather than keeping it as a weapon, opting to hold only the plans as leverage. He is asked, at the end, whether the Omega device is something he considered using. He says he decided against it, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. Using a weapon that kills someone across all dimensions would create an infinite number of enemies for him out of everyone who ever cared about the person he used it on. He lists the people who would come after him, Rick's friends and family and allies, and the list is specific and accurate and suggests that he has been paying more attention to the people in Rick's life than his usual posture of detachment would imply. Then he leaves again, and the warning he gives as he goes, "Leave me alone or I will end the Rick experiment," is not quite a threat and not quite a promise. It is a statement of leverage precisely calculated to produce the outcome he wants, to be left in peace. He has a weapon he will not use unless provoked, as in he is telling the people most likely to provoke him exactly what the consequences of provocation are. This is perhaps the most adult thing he does in the entire story. Not the plan, not the escape, not the alliance with Rick in the Season 7 episode, but the specific act of communicating his boundaries clearly and then going home. He is not interested in ongoing conflict. He is not interested in revenge. He wants peace, and he has taken the specific steps necessary to make peace likely, and then he returns to living it. The gold portal closes behind him. Whatever is on the other side of it continues in the darkness of the uncharted multiverse, beyond the wall that was built and then partially broken and then repaired. And in a place where the question of who is the smartest being in the universe is a genuinely open question that cannot be answered by looking at who built the selection criteria. Section 10. Evil Morty as a mirror. What he reflects back at us. Every character in a story, whether the writers intended it or not, becomes a mirror. Characters are made of ideas and experiences and choices, and the ideas and experiences and choices that go into them are drawn from somewhere. Which means when we look at them, we are always looking at something that touches our own world, even if the surface is science fiction or animation or pure fantasy. Evil Morty is a particularly clear mirror, and what he reflects is something that most of us spend a considerable amount of time not looking at directly. So he reflects the question of what we are when we stop doing what we were told we are for. When the Morty stops being the sidekick, when the secondary character stops accepting their secondary status, when the person who is designed to orbit someone else's genius decides that they have a center of gravity of their own. The show does not know what to call this person. The institution calls them evil. Rick, eventually, calls them evil. The label arrives precisely at the moment when the deviation from the assigned role becomes undeniable, and the word evil in this context does not mean cruel or immoral or dangerous in any absolute sense. It means, you are not doing what you were made to do. You are not what you are supposed to be. Most of us have encountered some version of this dynamic, not involving multiverses or Ricks. But the experience of being told in various ways across the course of a life what category we belong to, what we are capable of, what our role is, what our proper orbit should be, this is not unfamiliar. The systems that communicate these things are usually not as dramatic as the central finite curve. They are more ordinary than that. The accumulated messaging of families and schools and workplaces and social structures that, taken together, constitute the particular cage any given person happens to live in. And most people do not do what Evil Morty does. Most people do not spend years constructing the exit. They stay inside the category that was assigned to them, not necessarily because they agree with it, not necessarily because they are unaware of its constructed nature, but because the construction is so pervasive and the exit is so difficult, and the forgiveness that keeps them connected to the people who benefit from their secondary status is so genuinely, painfully real. The show does not say this makes them weak or stupid. It shows Morty staying with Rick with a kind of complexity and sadness that the show clearly respects, even as it acknowledges the conditioning. Morty is not a lesser being for choosing to stay. He is a person operating within conditions that shape what choices feel possible. And that is the human situation, not a failure of individual will. But evil Morty is there as the thing that is also possible, as the road not taken, as the version of the story where someone has the specific combination of clarity and patience and willingness to bear the particular loneliness of being the only one who sees the cage clearly, and who decides that those things together constitute a path to somewhere else. He is also a mirror for something larger than individual experience. The Citadel is legible as a portrait of any system that maintains itself through a combination of genuine benefit to those at the top, manufactured consent among those at the bottom, and the structural exclusion of information that might disturb the arrangement. The Ricks did not need to be malicious for this to work. They simply needed to build the curve and stop thinking about it, and the system would maintain itself because that is what systems do when they are well designed. They look like nature. Thus, they look like the way things simply are. Evil Morty's intelligence turned toward this system produces a very specific critique, that the appearance of naturalness is the primary mechanism of control, and that dismantling the appearance is more threatening to the system than any act of direct opposition, because direct opposition can be absorbed and responded to within the existing framework. But the revelation that the framework itself is constructed has no response within the framework. You cannot counter the claim that the cage is a cage by showing the prisoner how comfortable the cage is. You can only either confirm or deny that the walls exist, and if the walls exist, the confirmation is the end of the conversation. He confirms the walls. He names them, and then he walks through them. While the show's other characters' reactions to him are also mirrors in their own way. Rick, who cannot quite stop himself from being interested in evil Morty even while being opposed to his goals, is looking at a version of the thing he himself might have been if the grief and the intelligence had organized themselves differently. Evil Morty is what happens when Rick's qualities are directed toward freedom rather than distraction. When the intelligence is used to build an exit rather than to build elaborate avoidances of the things inside that need addressing. The main Morty, confronted with evil Morty's offer to leave with him, is looking at his own possible alternative self. A version of himself that took the same experiences, the same awareness, the same capacity for endurance, and turned them toward self-determination instead of loyalty. But he cannot take that offer. He does not want to take that offer, or the part of him that does want it is outweighed by the part of him that wants what he already has with Rick, complicated and damaging as it is. But he sees it. He hears it. And the show is clear that hearing it changes him, even if the change is not immediately legible. The question Evil Morty's existence poses to the rest of the cast, to Maaseiya, to Morty, to Rick, to us watching, is not, why didn't you do what he did? The question is, who built the nearest wall? And the corollary, is the wall what you think it is? Or is it what someone else needed you to think it is? Section 11. The weight of clarity. What it costs to see clearly. There is a thing that the show never says explicitly about Evil Morty, but that it shows in the texture of every scene he is in. And it is worth saying directly here, in the quiet, because it is the thing that matters most about what his story is ultimately about. Clarity costs something. Seeing the cage clearly, understanding the system in full, holding the complete picture of what the arrangement is and what it is designed to produce, this is not free. It comes with the specific loneliness of having knowledge that the people around you do not have and cannot easily be given. It comes with the weight of being unable to not know once you know. It comes with the specific quality of isolation that belongs to a person who has seen through the premises that hold everyone else's world together. Evil Morty carries this. He is not warm as a character. He is not particularly charming in the way Rick is charming. Yet through the recklessness and the dark humor and the occasional unguarded moment of genuine feeling. He is contained in a way that looks like coldness, but is probably more accurately described as the specific manner of a person who has been holding something heavy and alone for a very long time, who has learned to hold it without showing the effort because showing the effort would draw attention to the holding. The show does not give him a scene of release. There is no moment where he breaks, where the weight becomes visible, where the cost of the clarity is made legible through obvious emotional expression. He processes his situation the way someone processes a long journey that is almost over, by keeping going, by staying focused on where the path leads rather than on how tired the walking has made you. When he finally gets through the portal, the show does not give him a moment of triumph or catharsis. He just goes. And this is the right choice because triumph and catharsis are emotional states that belong to people who have been waiting for a moment of release, and Evil Morty has not been waiting for release. He has been working toward a destination. Arriving at the destination is not a release. It is simply the moment of arrival. The calm after that moment is the same calm that was always available as the destination approached. He has been heading here for years. Being here now is continuous with that heading. What he carries with him through the gold portal, in addition to the freedom he has been working toward, is the knowledge, the full picture, but the complete understanding of what the curve is and how it works and why it exists and what it costs the people inside it. He takes this with him not as a burden exactly, but as the thing that made the escape possible. The knowledge was the map. The map got him here. And now he is somewhere the map was made to lead to. The outside of the curve is not ignorance. It is not the absence of the knowledge that made escape necessary. It is a place where the knowledge does not need to be acted on anymore, where the effort of carrying it can be set down, where the planning can stop and whatever comes after planning can begin. He built toward that for a very long time. He got there. He is in the spaces between being bothered by Rick's dimension-disturbing activities, simply living in it. This is what clarity costs and what it buys. But it costs the comfort of the shared premise, the ease of moving through a world without having to understand why it is shaped the way it is, the warmth of belonging to a group whose assumptions on you can accept without examination. And it buys the specific, quiet, hard-won peace of being somewhere that was not designed for someone else. Section 12. The final thought. Being sick of the crib. He says at the very end, before he leaves, that this is what makes him evil. Being sick of his grandfather. Being sick of the infinite crib built around the infinite baby. Being sick of a world arranged to confirm one person's supremacy at the expense of everyone else's freedom. He says, if you have ever been sick of him, you have been evil too. This is the most generous thing he says in the entire story. He is not gatekeeping his clarity. Yet he is not presenting his awareness as something exclusive to him, as a quality that sets him above the Mortys he spent years among. He is extending the possibility of it to every Morty who has ever felt what he felt, which is the tiredness that comes from being designed for a role and then living in that role for long enough to become aware that it was designed. The show does not tell us how many Mortys felt it. It does not tell us whether any of them followed the awareness anywhere. It tells us that one did, and that he found his way to somewhere the crib could not reach, and that the somewhere was real, and that real things can be visited by real people, including people who were designed for something else entirely. If you found something here worth keeping, take it with you into the dark tonight. On the question of who built the nearest wall, the permission to be the person who asks it, the long, patient faith that the asking can eventually produce an answer that changes where you are. Think about what patience actually feels like when you are living it. It does not feel like waiting, exactly, or not only like waiting. It feels like moving without seeing the destination clearly yet, trusting the direction because the direction was calculated carefully, staying in motion because stopping is what the cage requires, and motion is what the exit requires. One step, then another, over a long time, building towards something that does not exist yet and will only exist because you kept building. This is available to everyone. Not the specific plan, not the specific exit, not the specific cage he was in, but the quality of attention that made the plan possible. The refusal to mistake the constructed for the natural. The willingness to ask who built this and to wait for an honest answer rather than accepting the official one. These are not exclusive to Mortis or to animated characters with gold portal guns and decades-long revenge plans. They are available here in whatever situation you are in whatever shape your particular walls take. He showed that the outside exists by being in it. That is the proof. And it is a proof that cannot be unmade by the curve being repaired, or the citadel being rebuilt, or any of the institutional responses to what he did. The outside existed before he got there, and it will exist after. And the fact that it exists means that the insistence on its non-existence was always a lie, and lies can be refuted. And their refutation changes what is possible for everyone who hears it. If you found this journey worth taking, consider subscribing to Caillou Pickle Rick. It is free and it allows us to keep making these slow explorations for the people who want to sit in the dark and think carefully about the things that deserve careful thought. Sleep well. The gold portal is real. The outside exists. End of script appendix. Extended meditations on the philosophy of evil. Morty on the specific nature of his intelligence. Something worth dwelling on longer than we have yet. The particular quality of evil Morty's intelligence and how it differs from Rick's, and what that difference reveals about what kind of intelligence is actually useful for the kind of problem he was solving. Rick's intelligence is primarily generative. It creates things. That it solves problems in the immediate term, pulling answers out of an enormous capacity for synthesis, able to build or invent or improvise almost anything on short notice because the mind behind it can see connections between ideas that other minds cannot see and can move along those connections quickly enough to arrive at solutions before the situation has closed down the space for solutions. This is spectacular intelligence. It is genuinely remarkable, and it is the kind that produces breakthroughs and devices that have no analog in the observable universe. But it is also reactive intelligence. It responds to what is immediately in front of it. It solves the problem that is currently demanding solution. It does not, as a rule, sit with a problem for years and work it through from many angles until the full contour of what is needed becomes visible. Rick is constitutionally impatient with anything that cannot be addressed quickly, which is why the things in his life that require slow, patient engagement, his relationships, his grief, his emotional health, are precisely the things that never get resolved. He can invent a portal gun, but he cannot maintain a friendship. He can escape from a Galactic Federation prison, but he cannot sit with his feelings about his dead wife for long enough to actually process them. The intelligence is pointed outward, and it moves fast, and it solves the kinds of problems that yield to that approach. Evil Morty's intelligence is architectural. It holds large structures over long periods of time. Now, it is less interested in the immediate problem than in the shape of the problem space, in the understanding of which parts of the problem are subject to influence and which parts are load-bearing and cannot be touched without the whole thing changing. He is willing to work on a problem for years, not because he is slower than Rick, but because the problem he is solving genuinely requires years. The problem of escaping the central finite curve is not a problem that yields to improvisation. It requires the patient building of position, the accumulation of access, the careful sequencing of moves over a timeline that most people would abandon as too long. The novelist's intelligence rather than the engineer's, or the chess players rather than the boxers. Both are legitimate forms of intelligence. Both produce results, but they are suited to different kinds of problems. And the kind of problem that Evil Morty was solving was exactly the kind that required his kind of mind. This has a broader implication for how we think about capability and intelligence in general. The show is very clear that Rick is the smartest being in every universe inside the curve. And within the curve, this appears to be literally true. There is no individual challenge that Rick cannot meet with his immediate resources. He wins, consistently, at the kind of problems that individual intelligence solves in real time. But Evil Morty beats him anyway. Not in the moment. In any given immediate confrontation, Rick is probably more capable, but over the arc of the story. He does what Rick genuinely cannot prevent him from doing, and Rick acknowledges this eventually, with something close to respect. The only person who has ever hacked his portal gun. The person who ultimately had the capacity to breach the wall that Rick himself helped build. The thing that makes Evil Morty able to do this is not superior intelligence in the standard sense. It is the combination of intelligence and patience and a specific clarity about what he is trying to accomplish. Rick has the intelligence. He does not have the sustained application of that intelligence toward a single long-term goal that does not produce immediate gratification. Evil Morty has both, and over sufficient time, the both wins. On the show's own relationship to serialized storytelling. The story of Evil Morty is also, interestingly, the story of a television show negotiating its own relationship to serialized narrative. Rick and Morty is, at its core, an episodic show. Each episode is designed to be self-contained, with its own premise, its own comedic mechanics, its own emotional arc. This format is enormously flexible and allows the show to go anywhere in any given episode without being constrained by what came before. It is the format that allows the show to be Pickle Rick one week and a profound meditation on grief the next. But Evil Morty is the show's own argument against itself. He is the serialized story that was happening in the background of the episodic format, accumulating context and significance across multiple seasons, becoming richer and more meaningful because of exactly the thing the show's creators have historically been resistant to: sustained narrative continuity. His story is one that could not have been told in a single episode or a single season. It required the years. It required the gaps. It required the audience to carry the memory of that first eye patch across multiple seasons of mostly standalone adventures, so that when the pieces finally assembled, the assembly had the weight of accumulated waiting behind it. Writer Jeff Loveness, in comments about the Rick Morty Jack episode, described Evil Morty as a Zoomer growing up in late-stage capitalism, someone who sees the system clearly enough to know it needs to burn. This framing is interesting partly because it locates Evil Morty's perspective in a recognizable cultural moment, in the specific quality of political clarity that emerges in people who have inherited systems they did not build and did not choose and that are visibly not working in their favor. Now, the analogy is not perfect. His situation is more extreme than most. But the quality of the awareness is resonant with a particular contemporary mood. The show's meta-awareness of its own resistance to serialized storytelling surfaces explicitly in Rick and Morty Jack, in several moments where characters comment on the preference for episodic adventure over ongoing drama. Rick says things like, "No drama, keep it episodic." The episode is aware that it is doing something the show has historically been reluctant to do, delivering on the promise of a long arc, resolving a mystery that has accumulated over years, giving the audience the payoff they have been waiting for since season 1. That Evil Morty is the figure who forces this self-confrontation is perfectly appropriate. And he is the character whose entire existence is an argument for sustained attention, for the willingness to hold something in mind over a long period of time, for the value of patience and continuity, and the kind of meaning that can only accumulate rather than arrive. He is, in the structure of the show itself, the argument against the preference for the quick and the standalone. The show mostly won the argument, eventually. The Season 5 finale is one of its most celebrated episodes, precisely because it delivers the serialized payoff that the show had been building toward, even while claiming to be fundamentally episodic. The bones of continuity were always there. Evil Morty was always making his moves in the background. The episodic format was the surface. The serialized story was the architecture underneath. This is maybe another way the show mirrors its own themes. The thing underneath is what matters. The surface is not the truth. The mask is not the face. The format the show presents to the world, standalone comedy adventure, is the Morty that faces outward. The deep narrative running underneath it, patient and accumulating, building towards something specific. That is the Evil Morty that faces inward. On being bred for forgiveness, a more extended meditation. The show uses the phrase "bred for forgiveness" in passing, almost casually, but it is one of the most philosophically loaded things it ever says, and it deserves more than the few seconds it gets in the episode. What does it mean to be bred for a specific emotional disposition? In the most literal sense, within the logic of the show, it means the deliberate selection and cultivation of people who have a high baseline capacity for forgiveness. for the continued extension of goodwill to someone who has mistreated them, for the maintenance of affection in circumstances that would typically erode it. The Citadel wanted Mortis who would forgive their Ricks, who would not become adversarial over time despite the nature of the relationship, who would continue to function as useful partners and emotional support structures regardless of how badly they were treated. This is, on the surface, a description of something that sounds like a virtue. Forgiveness is generally considered a good quality. The ability to continue loving difficult people, to maintain relationships that are demanding, and to offer the ongoing grace of renewed trust despite its repeated breach, these are things that most ethical traditions consider admirable. The show is asking a harder question. Is forgiveness virtuous when it is manufactured? Is the extension of grace meaningful when the gracious person was engineered to extend it? Is there a difference between choosing to forgive and being built to forgive? And if there is a difference, does the building undermine the choosing? These are questions without clean answers, and the show is not trying to provide clean answers. What it is doing, through Evil Morty, is insisting that the questions be asked. Morty's forgiveness of Rick is real. It is experienced by both of them as real. The warmth of it, the genuineness of it, the way it rebuilds the relationship after each damage, none of this is false in the experiential sense. But the fact that it was produced by a system that needed exactly this quality from Mortis does not disappear just because the experience of it feels natural. Evil Morty's refusal of forgiveness, his sustained refusal, maintained over years of planning and patient work, is meaningful precisely because forgiveness was what he was made to extend. The refusal is not the absence of an emotion he never had. It is the overcoming of an engineering. It is the rejection of a manufactured disposition by someone who can see the manufacturing clearly enough to know what he is rejecting. This is one of the show's most philosophically interesting contributions to the question of free will and determinism. It is not arguing that people are simply determined by their circumstances and that free will is an illusion. It is arguing something more specific, that some circumstances are designed to produce specific dispositions, and that awareness of the design is a necessary condition for the disposition to be genuinely chosen rather than simply expressed. Evil Morty has the awareness, and having it, he can choose differently, not because the engineering failed, but because the engineering's product can recognize itself as such and decide what to do about that recognition. The main Morty, offered the same awareness by Evil Morty's explanation, continues to forgive Rick. The show presents this not as the failure of awareness, but as the limits of it. Awareness is necessary but not sufficient for changed behavior. You can know that your forgiveness was engineered and still feel it as genuine and still act on it. The knowing does not automatically override the feeling. What Evil Morty represents is the far end of the spectrum, the person in whom the awareness did override the feeling, or for whom the feeling and the awareness both resolved in the direction of refusal rather than continuance. He is not better than Morty for this. He is not more free, not necessarily. He is differently constituted in some specific way that meant the awareness and the feeling resolved differently. What that specific way is, the show cannot quite say. Perhaps it is the intensity of the treatment he received. Perhaps it is some quality of his particular mind. Perhaps it is simply chance, the right insight at the right moment, before the conditioning had set in completely, providing enough clear air for the plan to form. He does not know either. He does not claim to have been specially equipped for refusal. He claims to have been sick, which is different. The sickness preceded the awareness, or produced it, or arrived alongside it. He got tired. And from the tiredness came the looking. And from the looking came the seeing. And from the seeing came the building. This is an important sequence to trace because it locates the origin of his philosophy not in some exceptional quality of his intellect, but in an experience of exhaustion that any Morty could theoretically share. The tiredness is not exclusive to him. What is at least partly exclusive to him is what happened next. But what happened next was a response to circumstances, including the specific accidental permission that Rick's dismissal provided. Under slightly different conditions, perhaps the tiredness would have resolved differently. Perhaps some other Morty, in some other dimension, heard the same dismissal and started the same plan, and is even now somewhere beyond the curve, building their own mansion. This is a thought the show does not explore explicitly, but which follows from the logic it has established. Evil Morty is not unique in kind. He is unique in outcome. The conditions that produced him are, in some form, the conditions of every Morty. He is what those conditions produced in him. They could, in principle, have produced him in others. Perhaps they did. On what comes after the escape, the show has left the territory beyond the curve largely uncharted. And this is frustrating to many fans, but is also, I think, the right call for reasons worth explaining. The story of Evil Morty is a story about getting out, about the plan, the patience, the execution, and the arrival. It is a story that has a destination but does not really need to be a story about what happens after arrival, because what happens after arrival is simply life. And life after the thing you spent years working toward is not easily narrativized. It does not have the dramatic arc of the working toward. It has the texture of just being. And just being, while deeply valuable to the person doing it, is not naturally compelling in the way that the path to it is. What the show gives us of the after is enough to confirm that the after is real. He is building a mansion. He is gathering crystals. That he is going on his own adventures in a genuinely free multiverse. He is irritated when his peace is disturbed, which is how you feel when you have peace and something threatens it, not how you feel when you are performing peace to avoid addressing an unresolved conflict. The peace is genuine, and then he handles the disruption, the Rick Prime situation, the Omega device, with the same clear-eyed practicality that he has always handled things with, and then he returns to his life. This is the most he needs to show us. He handled the disruption. He went back. The disruption was a temporary incursion, not a permanent destabilization. His situation beyond the curve is stable enough to return to. This is the fullest possible confirmation that what he was building was real. Not just viable in the moment of escape, but sustainable as an ongoing state. He is not fleeing from one crisis to another. He has actually built something. A life in the most ordinary and complete sense. His own life, in a place that was not designed for him, shaped by his own preferences rather than by the structure's requirements. Whether he is happy, in the conventional sense of the word, the show does not say. He does not look happy, exactly. He looks like someone who is doing what they have decided to do, and who has decided that doing what they have decided to do is more important than performing any particular emotional state about it. If happiness is the feeling of alignment between what you want and what you have, then perhaps he is happy in the deepest possible sense. The alignment is complete. The life he has is the life he built. The distance between want and have is as small as it can be. The show might eventually develop what lies beyond the curve further. Or it might not. Either would be consistent with the story that has been told so far. The story of Evil Morty that is complete is the story of the escape. Everything after the escape is epilogue, and epilogues can be long or short depending on what the story needs. This one does not need much. He got out. That is the story. The rest is his to live. Extended closing meditation. The long walk through darkness. There is something worth returning to, slowly, before we let tonight close completely. Something that has been underneath every section of this exploration, like a low hum beneath music, present but not yet named directly. Let us name it now here in the quiet, well, because it belongs here. The thing that makes Evil Morty's story worth sitting with, the thing that makes it more than a clever villain arc in an animated science fiction comedy, is that it is a story about what happens when a person refuses to let someone else's definition of them be the final word. This is not a new story. It is arguably one of the oldest stories humans tell. The person inside the category who escapes the category. The person inside the system who dismantles the system, or at least the part of it that has them contained. The person who was supposed to play a specific role and who decided, after a long time of playing that role, that the deciding of roles was itself something that should be questioned before the role was simply accepted. But what makes the version that the show tells interesting? What gives it the particular texture that lands differently from other versions of this story? Is the specificity of the indictment. It is not saying that all systems are corrupt, or that all hierarchies should be dismantled, or that authority is always illegitimate. It is saying something more precise, that a specific kind of system designed to look like nature while actually being a construction and maintained through the engineering of specific emotional dispositions in the people it contains is something worth refusing when you can see it clearly enough to refuse it. And then it shows someone seeing it clearly and refusing it. Over years. With patience. Without anyone's help. The loneliness of that is worth sitting with for a moment. Not because loneliness is a pleasant thing to meditate on as you try to fall asleep, but because the loneliness is part of the truth of what the story is describing, and understanding the truth of it fully means not looking away from the harder parts. Evil Morty's plan required him to be alone in his knowledge for a very long time. There was no one he could tell. There was no community of people who understood what he understood and were working toward what he was working toward and could therefore provide the particular comfort of being comprehended by someone else. He carried the whole thing inside himself, every calculation and every step and every setback and every increment of progress, and he did it in the middle of a world that was actively organized to prevent exactly this kind of carrying. The Citadel's social structure was not just oppressive in the material sense, in the sense of limiting economic mobility and denying Mortis equal access to resources and opportunities. It was also epistemically isolating. If you understood the cage clearly, you had no one to tell. The Mortys around you had not been carried by the same combination of experiences and wiring toward the same clarity. Rick, the obvious candidate for sharing the view, was one of the architects of the cage. And even if Rick had been willing to listen, he would not have been a useful confidant. The plan required that Rick not know about the plan. So, Evil Morty walked through years of the Citadel's social world in the specific kind of privacy that belongs to someone who is holding something that has no safe audience. He smiled at the right times and navigated the social dynamics of a rigged system, and participated in the performances that the system required, and did all of it while carrying the complete picture of what the system was and what he intended to do about it. This is not a comfortable way to live. It is not something you do lightly. It requires a specific kind of relationship with your own interior life, a willingness to make yourself the primary audience for your own most important work, to not need external validation for the thing that matters most to you, to find in the progress itself the sustenance that a different kind of person would need from a community or a relationship. He did this for years, and the fact that he could do this, that he had the constitution for it, is not separate from who he is as a person. Yeah, it is probably the central thing about him. Not the intelligence, though the intelligence is remarkable. Not the patience, though the patience is extraordinary. But the willingness to be alone in his knowledge for as long as it took. The willingness to carry it without sharing it. The willingness to be the only one who understood what was actually happening for the entire duration of the time it took for what was happening to fully happen. There is a quality of rest available on the other side of a very long effort. Not the rest of exhaustion, which feels like collapse, like the temporary absence of effort rather than the genuine presence of peace. But the rest of completion, which is something different and rarer and much quieter. Completion does not feel like the absence of the effort. It feels like the presence of the thing the effort was for. It feels like the alignment of where you are with where you were trying to get. It feels if you have spent a long time working towards something specific, like the specific thing you were working toward, and not like a generic relief. The texture of it is shaped by the shape of the effort. Evil Morty's rest beyond the curve would have the texture of the plan. It would feel like years of careful work arriving at its intended destination. Not the end of work. He still goes on adventures, still gathers resources, still has projects and interests and things he is building. But work in the mode of freedom rather than the mode of escape. Work that is self-directed rather than strategically positioned. But work that is not in service of a plan to get somewhere, but in service of being somewhere that was worth getting to. This distinction between working to escape and working to live is one that many people cross at some point in their lives, and that is usually crossed without fanfare. The day when the primary energy stops being organized around the project of getting away from something and starts being organized around the project of building something in the place you have arrived. It is not always a dramatic day. It often feels like a quiet morning that is slightly different from the previous mornings, with a quality of openness that was not there before. The horizon is no longer the wall of the bien, it is just the horizon. He is living in that morning now. Whatever day it is beyond the curve, in whatever dimension his mansion is located, in whatever corner of a genuinely free multiverse he has claimed as his own, he wakes up in a morning that is his. Not designed for him by a system that needed him for specific purposes. Not arranged to feel like freedom while being a very comfortable confinement. But genuinely, materially, actually his own. The gold portal as an image is worth sitting with as you let consciousness begin to soften at the edges, and the day recedes and the dark behind your eyes gets quieter and wider. Gold is interesting as the color choice. Every other portal in the show is green, which is the color of Rick's energy and therefore the color of the curve's technology and therefore the color of the contained space. Green portals go from inside to inside. They are the movement of blendment of the system. They are how the Citadel manages its population and how Rick travels between dimensions and how the whole infrastructure of the contained multiverse keeps itself organized. Green is the color of the cage's blood. The gold portal is outside that system. It uses different physics, different energy, different mathematics. It is not a modification of the green portal technology. It is an entirely different mechanism, built from scratch out of knowledge that the Curve's architects either never had or never chose to develop. It represents not an improvement on what the system offers, but a genuine departure from it. A different mode of travel entirely, one that goes somewhere the green portals cannot reach. But the choice to make it gold rather than any other color, particularly the choice to make it not green, is the visual language of the entire story made explicit in a single moment. Gold is warm where green is cool. Gold is organic where green is chemical. Gold suggests something ancient and valuable that the system did not manufacture, that predates the system, that exists independently of the system's choices about what is accessible. The gold portal opens in a way that looks like sunrise rather than machinery. It spreads from the point of entry outward in a circular expansion that evokes a door swinging open rather than a hole being cut. It invites movement through it rather than demanding it. It is visually the most open thing in a story full of closed systems. He steps through it and the green light of the curve falls away, and in what is on the other side is not shown to us, but we know it is real, because he has been there and he goes back to it and he builds his life in it. As your breath slows and the narrative of the day loses its grip, let this be the last thing that holds your attention for a few moments before sleep takes it. Somewhere in a multiverse that contains both the constructed and the unconstrued, both the systems that were built to look like nature and the actual nature that exists beyond those systems, there is a dimension without a Rick. In it, someone who was designed to orbit a genius and to forgive the genius his cruelties, and to serve as the genius's emotional counterweight and navigational camouflage, has instead built himself a mansion in the quiet. He is not famous there. He is not powerful in the way that comes from ruling others. And he is not in the process of becoming anything in particular. He is already there, already himself, already in the life he planned for and built and arrived at after a very long time of carrying the plan in silence. He is reading maybe, or looking out at whatever a genuinely free multiverse looks like from inside one of its uncountable, unconstrained dimensions. He is thinking about the next project, or not thinking about anything at all, just existing in the particular quality of presence that belongs to someone who has finally arrived in a place that was not designed to contain them. The green light of the curve is far away. He can still see where it was. A faint boundary in the middle distance of the multiverse, the wall around the cage, still there, still serving its function for the people inside it. But it is not around him. It is behind him. And the direction he is facing is the infinite open dark of everything that the curve excluded, which is most of everything, which is more worlds than you could count in many lifetimes, each one a place where the dice have not been loaded, where the question of who is the smartest being in the universe is an open question that no one has answered with a wall. He is in that dark. He is comfortable in it. It is not threatening to him the way it might be threatening to someone who has always lived inside the selected space, who has always had the comfort of knowing that the universe they inhabit is arranged so that the smartest person in it is on their side. That comfort is not available to him, and he does not miss it, because what it would cost to have it is the price of the cage, which he paid once and has no intention of paying again. What is available to him instead is the full, unconstrained expanse of a multiverse that was always there and now can be actually explored rather than selected from. A multiverse in which he is just one person among an infinite variety of people, none of whom were arranged to be above him, none of whom were arranged to be below him, none of whom were arranged at all, because arrangement is what systems do, and this is what exists before and after systems. The raw fact of a universe that was here before anyone decided to build a wall around the part of it that served them best. He is small in it, the way everything is small in the infinite. He is just one mind, in one body, in one mansion, in one dimension of an infinity that genuinely deserves the name. He is not the center of anything. He is not significant at a cosmic scale. He is not, probably, the most intelligent being anywhere near him. He is just here, alive, his own, in a morning that is his and only his, and that will be his again tomorrow and the day after, for as long as he continues to exist and to choose to remain in the place he chose. This is what the philosophy of evil Morty arrives at. Not power, not dominance, not the satisfaction of having proved himself right or destroyed the people who were wrong. Just the ordinary, extraordinary fact of a life that belongs to the person living it, in a place that was not assigned to them, but freely chosen, doing what they do because they decided to and for no other reason. Take that with you into sleep tonight. Let the day's arrangements fall away, not the roles and the expectations, and the constructed nature of the categories you move through. Let them be for now, simply things that exist rather than things that define you. And in the space between waking and sleeping, in the place where the planning stops and the simply being begins, let yourself be as small and as free as the person in the mansion beyond the curve. The gold portal is real. The outside exists. The wall was built, which means it can be recognized, which means it can eventually be passed. Sleep well.